I'm sometimes asked, Andrew, if I go where I'm treated best, what happens if that country becomes difficult? Do I want to be constantly moving? And today, I'm going to address exactly how to prepare for that. What I'm going to tell you today is my own little discussed experience of my family wanting to move overseas when I was a child. We ultimately did not. But I want to tell you what I experienced when I was in Portugal recently, which is just being around a culture that historically was this maritime culture that went out, relatively small country, and went out and explored the world. Those people, I think just in the DNA to a certain extent, were used to going out and exploring new worlds. And that is a part of who they are. Understanding that we don't always have to stay here. Let's have an adventure. Let's go and explore the next thing. And so my family discussed doing that back in the mid-1990s. We ultimately didn't, but I want to walk you through the places that we considered going. Ultimately, what happened to those countries and what I take away from that and what you can think of as you're preparing your global citizen lifestyle. If it's your first time here, I'm Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consulting firm that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best, including all the aspects on a very holistic level of taxes, immigration, lifestyle, everything involved with moving overseas or just setting up a plan B in preparation for possibly moving overseas in the future, because the world is getting crazy and people need options. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. So we saw the writing on the wall in my family, and I've told you that when I was 12 years old, my father would bring home the report of the world's freest economies. And I've seen for about a quarter of a century now the United States drifting lower. Now it's behind a number of post-communist countries. And we just kind of saw before our very eyes freedom leaving. And there was a certain prescience of what we would discuss in the household of, hey, this is what's going to happen. And it did happen. So the 4 countries that we talked about were New Zealand, Australia, Argentina, and Chile. Obviously, I'm 11, 12, 13 years old at the time. I wasn't doing as much of the talking, but this is what was being discussed. And so I wanted to go through those 4 and kind of share with you some commonalities and kind of what would have happened had we had moved to those places and what would have happened to me. Maybe there would be no Nomad Capitalist because I wouldn't have been dealing with all the issues of living in the U.S. and everything that comes with that. But there's an ultimate takeaway that I think you should be aware of, because you could have lived in any of those places for the last 25 years, and up until now, you probably would have been fine. Maybe Argentina would be the one that was difficult. So New Zealand, obviously a country that did pretty well. It's not the most thrilling place to live, and so if you're from New Zealand, obviously you may love your country. If you're coming to there, you probably want to be prepared for a slower paced lifestyle. I've told people who are looking to move to New Zealand, because that's kind of like the billionaire's place to go in some regards. Look at places like Uruguay, look at Jersey, look at other places where maybe you have some of the same elements with better taxes and it's more flexible, and now with their new really expensive residence permits. It was expensive to go to New Zealand back in the mid-90s, and now it's really expensive just to get in. The taxes in New Zealand still aren't the worst in the world, especially if you're an investor. I mean, it's not like world-leading low taxation, but it's better than the US, it's better than Canada, it's better than Australia next door in many cases, but increasingly it is becoming more authoritarian. However, if you would have looked, from 1995 or 96 to 2020, you got a quarter century out of living in New Zealand. What would you have done at that time? You would have gotten New Zealand citizenship, one of the best passports in the world. There's no taxation on a worldwide level, and exiting the country is easier than exiting a number of other Western countries. So you could build a business, and you could one day say, you know what, I'm just going to pack my bags and go. Australia obviously is one of the more difficult countries to leave, but again, if you would have moved to Australia in the mid-90s, you would have become a citizen, good passport. Obviously, both of those you can kind of move back and forth between Australia and New Zealand if you're a citizen of one. And so the economy did well, skipped some recessions. Taxes were pretty crazy. Obviously, the country has become a problem. You can't even leave or return to your own country. That's pretty much violating everything that even the UN thinks. And so that was a problem. But again, you had 25 years of handling that, not with low taxes, but you would have gotten a great passport out of that. Argentina is a different thing. If you would have moved from the United States to Argentina, my father always told me, play it straight. And that's where I talk about legally go where you're treated best. I believe in doing things legally. I always believe in playing by the rules. And I just you don't want to get in trouble. I'm not all for cutting corners. Argentina is a place where people just cut corners, right? You talk to people in Argentina, a lot of the wealthy people don't pay taxes. They rolled out a big one-time tax during COVID, so if you were there when that happened, you would have gotten squeezed. I think that someone coming from a more tax compliance culture that believes in just, okay, you follow the rules, would maybe have a harder time in Argentina because it's not really set up in the same way in terms of compliance. Doug Casey, who's going to be speaking at Nomad Capitalist Live again, says, hey, they leave you alone. I'm just the rich foreigner. They don't really bother me too much. It's a pretty good citizenship, not as good as Australia and New Zealand, but if you were living there, after a couple of years, you get their citizenship. You're not going to go to the U.S., but you can go to most other places in the world, and it's pretty well respected. And so I guess for people who are from Argentina and just don't bother to pay their taxes, maybe they would rather have that citizenship than being Australian and having the strict culture of enforcement. I personally like to follow the rules. Argentina's obviously had a lot of chaos, but again, Doug Casey's like, you can kind of avoid that. I happen to think if you structure yourself properly, you can avoid it. Now, is that the place that you want to go? Yeah, perhaps not. But there are places in Argentina where it's worked out, but you've had capital controls, and so it's probably just not a good place to go. Taxes are crazy, capital restrictions. I mean, just overall would have been the worst selection on there. That said, if you could have taken the citizenship, you could have lived there in perhaps relative peace if you had your assets offshore. And so back in the mid-90s, the idea was, let's move somewhere. I don't entirely know what would have happened. Like, I don't think we would have moved all of our assets to Argentina. So that's the ultimate case for diversification. You could live in Argentina and have everything else somewhere else. That could possibly work, but probably would have been the worst choice on the list. Chile would have been a great choice on the list because you would have gotten a passport just as good as Australia or New Zealand. Chile, not back then, but now, is a visa waiver program country to the U.S. You can go to the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the CUNA countries as we call them. You have a greater level of access through the Mercosur region in South America. You're obviously further away from it all. One thing about all these countries is they're further away from it all, right? So in times of war or famine or whatever could happen, I mean, you're further away. They're all kind of self-sufficient. That's the things that these countries have in common. So Chile would have been great. You could have had some tax incentives. You would have had a great passport, great quality of life, just more reasonable everything across the board as they kind of slash taxes, slash bureaucracy, made it easier, made it welcoming. You could have made some investments there that would have done incredibly well. I guess you could have said that about Australia too, but I tend to think that South America perhaps, there could be more sustainability there. So all of these you could have, if you would have moved there, you would have had a great passport within a matter of years, right? With Argentina being the worst and Argentina being the most chaotic. But you could have stayed in at least 3 of these countries over the last quarter century. And so now what's happening? New Zealand still doesn't have the worst taxes in the Western world. Not the best, not the worst. But compared to like Australia, compared to Canada, compared to the US, it is better. It's not go where you're treated better, it's go where you're treated best, but it is better, a little bit better. And so they have started taking away your freedoms. Australia started taking away your freedoms. To me, what's the point of being a citizen if you can't even come to your own country? That's the very point of citizenship. Chile is now making a hard turn to the left, and for the last couple of years, I felt like Chile was kind of jumping the shark, and I've told you that. But the point is, they would have been great places to live for 25 years. You would have gotten a great international experience. Certainly what I told my parents when I was just starting to want to be an entrepreneur at age 12 was, who am I going to sell to in New Zealand? There's like more sheep than people. And obviously the world has changed, or maybe I didn't even see it back then, but the world has certainly changed to where it doesn't really matter where you live, right? To people who push back on, I don't want to live in a small country, how do I do business? You do business online the way everyone else is doing business. You have a business that lives in the cloud, has a remote team, has whatever it is. You can do that from anywhere. Time zones could be an issue if you don't want to be working at 3 a.m. in New Zealand talking to people in the U.S., but otherwise, that could have worked. But the problem is, these countries are now turning. And so let's just look at that as an idea. Let's imagine that every country you go to gives you 25 years. Now, there's some places you could go that won't give you 25 years, so you want to think ahead. I think some people exaggerate some of the issues. China or Singapore will be taken over by China. If that's your reason for not moving, God bless you. Bless your heart. I don't know that I really agree with that as a reason for not going there. Obviously we're seeing increasing geopolitical tension. There's always been geopolitical tension. So everyone has their own theory. People think that, I don't want to move to Portugal because of what's happening in Ukraine. Not really sure that makes a huge difference. The same way, by the way, right? I always talk about Naperville, Illinois. Yeah, people lived in Naperville, Illinois to be safe. Not as safe as it once was, but they lived there to be safe. How far are you from Chicago? How far are you from the bad neighborhoods of other parts of, the Chicagoland area? You're a lot further than the distance between Portugal and Ukraine or Italy and Ukraine, right? So it starts to be a little bit much. But obviously, you can put a list of whatever your issues are, whatever your concerns are, and say, all right, here's the things that I think could happen in the next 25 years that would shorten this 25-year timeline, or what's called a generational timeline. And then I look at it and I say, imagine that every generation had to move somewhere new. Or what I'll talk to some people. I'm like, okay, you have a 13-year-old. What's your 13-year-old planning on doing? Oh, they want to get a job. Okay, listen, if you want to get a job, Australia is hardly the worst place in the world to get a job. Now, if you value making good money over some of the freedom aspects, if you don't mind the regulation, if you don't mind paying, what are they charging, like $1 million for a bottle of wine now? I don't know, but if you don't mind that, hey, it's not the worst place to get a job, right? Same with the U.S. We have people who it's like they want to renounce their U.S. citizenship, and they're like, I want to make sure my kids don't, because I think they want to get a job and work here. Yeah, you can't renounce your kids' citizenship for them. And sure, if your kids want to get a job, U.S. citizenship is very beneficial. You can earn a high salary, lots of opportunities. And so you never know what the next generation is going to want to do. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I have a sister who is a teacher, and she's an artist. And so maybe she would like living in New Zealand or Chile or Argentina with all the landscapes to paint, and she could get a job, and she may not matter to her some of these things. I mean, she doesn't travel internationally that much, and so for her, not being able to come and leave the country, she's a big guy, whatever, doesn't bother me, right? Who cares? Doesn't affect me. I think a lot of people think that way, and that's fine. So every generation may need to make the decision if they want to continue in the entrepreneurial tradition, if they want to continue in creating generational wealth for the family, that, hey, this may no longer be the place. Certainly, there are places you could choose that will last 50 years or 100 years, but I want you to have in your mind, I think people are looking at this as it has to be the be-all and the end-all. I'm going to go somewhere that's going to, for the end of time, work. There's no place on earth that's happened, right? You look at most empires, last a couple of centuries, and out they go, on to the next. What happens when you're living in one of those empires? People in the U.S. think about this. They're like, we're pretty close to kind of the average number of when the empires start to collapse, and we're showing some of the signs. And so what happens then? Are you just going to wait around and hope it doesn't happen? That's what most people do, and that's what we recommend that you don't do, is you want to be prepared. And so this is why having multiple citizenships is valuable. I think that really beyond just having a second citizenship these days, having a portfolio of 3 is really the ultimate diversification. Well, the ultimate is more, but 3 is a good number, right? 2 is 1, 1 is none, and 3 is better than 2. But if you look at this as 25 years, that's a heck of a long time that you could have just sat and enjoyed. These places weren't totally tax-free. Listen, you could go to Dubai for 25 years, you're not going to get citizenship. In all likelihood, you have to go somewhere else to get that. But you know what? You can probably enjoy a very tax-free, very low tax, good climate, good lifestyle, all of that. Maybe in 50 years, something changes. And maybe people need to make a decision. We can't plan everything. I'm all for planning long-term. I plan very long-term in many ways. But this idea that we're going to never have to fix anything in a history of thousands of years where empires rise and fall, to me is silly. Go in acknowledging that there may be a change once in a generation or every other generation. Plan accordingly with multiple citizenships. Plan accordingly with asset diversification. And if you look back on that, if you would have played that over the last 25 years, I think you would have been pretty good. No matter what happened in any one country, you would have had your assets over here, you would have had a business over here, you would have paid some taxes, and you would have had the option to leave. That's why I think diversification, rather than simply moving to a new country and taking everything with you, is so important. And if you realize that your kids may need to make the same choice, then you'll be stronger.